Hi, my name is Paul Butler, and I'm a law professor at George Washington University, and I'm also a former federal prosecutor. I prosecuted street crimes and also white-collar crimes for the Department of Justice.
And I'm Richard Ford. I'm a law professor at Stanford Law School, and I do work in the area of race relations, and federal anti-discrimination law, and civil rights, among other things. Hi, Paul.
Hey, Richard. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
I really liked the article in Slate. I thought it was very provocative. There were lots of things in it I didn't agree with, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I know you started out talking about the Jena 6 incident, so maybe you can kind of set it up for people who are listening, and we can talk about both our takes on it.
Sure. As many of our viewers may know, the Jena 6 controversy really began when, I would say it began when, quite a long time ago, when at some point in a high school in Jena, a tree on campus became designated as the white tree. It's a tree under which white students sat in a informally segregated campus, apparently. Apparently there were also black bleachers, and so the black students sat on the black bleachers. The white students sat under the white tree during their free periods. Obviously this wasn't a formal policy. Anyway, there was this all-campus rally or meeting in the school auditorium, and one black student, apparently a new student to the school, said, asked the principal whether he could sit under the white tree. And the principal said, as he should have, of course you can sit wherever you like. Shortly after the assembly, 3 black students then went and sat under the white tree. And the next day, there were nooses hanging from the white tree. And this, not surprisingly, set off a series of troubling racial tensions in Jena. And so there were a series of, apparently an escalating series of tensions and incidents between some white students and some black students.
Well, I think they started when they found out who actually hung the nooses, and the school, someone in the school recommended that the students be expelled.
That's right.
And the punishment from the school board was reduced from expulsion, again for these students who were obviously white, to a kind of minor slap on the wrist.
Right, 3 days suspended, I think. That's right. So the principal recommended expulsion, as I understood it, but the school board decided that it was a prank rather than a serious offense, and gave him 3 days suspension. And
obviously, to state the obvious, there's a whole bloody racial history of noose hangings, especially in a place like Louisiana. So, to dismiss something like that as a prank, I think justifiably outraged a number of the African American residents of Jena, but apparently not so many of the other people who live there. We should point out that this school is just about 10% black and 90% white.
Right. Okay, that's right. Yeah, and I agree with you that the nooses have to be seen in the context of racist lynchings and racist intimidation, and especially in the Deep South, and so that that's no prank.
But that is how the school board. That's how the school board viewed it. Apparently, with that again, extremely lenient punishment.
No, that's I agree with that. Now, after that, then we had a continuing series of racial incidents, as I understand it. Again, Paul, correct me if I don't get something right in terms of your understanding, but which including a couple incidents of arson. It wasn't ever clear who set the fires, but there was at least one fire set on the Jena campus. There were fights that included, I guess at one incident, 2 or 3 black students who were about to attend a party that was thrown by a white student, and they, at least according to them, they were invited. Someone tried to stop them from entering when they showed up at the party, and eventually threatened them with a beer bottle. And that was reported to the police, but the punishment was relatively mild. I think it was a misdemeanor they were charged with. And then there was another incident involving an altercation in a parking lot where I guess 3 black students and 1 white student had an altercation. And the facts depended on who you asked. The black students said that they were talking to but not threatening the white student. The white student said that they were threatening him. Anyway, he ran to his pickup truck and got a shotgun. They wrestled the shotgun away from him and took the shotgun, and then they were charged with, the black students who wrestled away the shotgun were charged with theft.
For stealing the gun. I mean, that's one of the most remarkable things about this whole incident. The black guys who take the gun in self-defense get charged with theft for stealing the gun. The white boy who's threatening these young black men doesn't get charged at all.
Right. So you have another incident. And then it culminates with, and so I mean, I agree there too that this is, we've got a few incidents, each of which are at best questionable, and interpreted in the worst light, outrageous,
and not just questionable in a race-neutral way, but again, at every turn we see the white boys getting off, not getting charged with anything or being treated very leniently, and then the African Americans being overcharged, in my mind, certainly not having the cases treated lightly. And I know that you're about to get to the most explosive charge.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I should hurry up and get there. I just wanted to set the stage so everyone would understand.
No, I think it's a great overview.
Okay, great. So that people could understand that the protest saw this all as one of a piece. Then ultimately, one day in school, there's an altercation between 6 black students who are the Jena 6 that we refer to, and 1 white student. Where I think the facts here were uncontroverted. There was some verbal altercation. The one fact that's contested is whether or not the white student used a racial epithet in that context. The black students say they did. He says he didn't. Anyway, one of the black students, and I believe they were all football players, punched the white student. He was knocked unconscious, and then they kicked him while he was laying on the ground unconscious. And that's the incident that led the prosecutor to charge at least some of the Jena 6 with first attempted murder. So that was it. Paul, do you know whether it was all 6 or just some of them? But I know attempted murder was the charge at least for
and I'm not sure whether it was all 6. What I do know is that they're charged with attempted murder for a victim. Again, his eyes are closed during this beating, which was a horrible thing that I wouldn't want to see, or certainly not to have happen to me or to anybody. But after this beating, he's taken to the hospital. He's released the same day. That night, there's some kind of social event at the high school, which he shows up to. So, and again, the young men who were involved in the fight with him are charged with attempted murder and are locked up. Right.
And that's the beginning of the real controversy. Now, I take it shortly thereafter the prosecutor reduced the charges to more sensible aggravated assault, and at the present moment, as I understand it, unless something's changed in the past couple of weeks, 5 of the 6 are out. There's also a question about whether they could be tried as adults. The prosecutor tried to charge Michael Bell as an adult and actually obtained a conviction, but that was reversed because it was improper for him to try Bell as an adult. So I guess, that's that. Those are the facts as I understand it. But Paul, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you provided a really helpful overview. And so,
great.
The what happened next is kind of more a story about civil rights and, as you so correctly pointed out in the Slate article, the next direction that civil rights takes. But why don't I explain why this case got people who are concerned about race relations in the United States so exercised?
Excellent.
So, again, as a former prosecutor, I know how race works in the criminal justice system, and at every single stage of the process, we know that race matters. Prosecutors have an extremely high amount of discretion. I was a baby lawyer when I did that work, Richard. I was just like 3 or 4 years out of law school, and I've never had so much power in my life, and I probably, as an attorney, never will. They're the most unregulated state actors in our entire legal system, so when they decide to bring a case, whether or not they decide to charge, how much they decide to charge, whether they plea bargain or not, and then the sentence that they ask for, it's only in the prosecutor's say. Nobody else has any oversight over that. And the concern is that prosecutors exercise this discretion in a race-based way. Again, in each one of those stages, from the charging decision to the decision about whether the plea bargain to sentencing, you name it. And again, there's pretty good evidence that suggests that's true. And especially in cases of violent crime, we see a lot more concern when victims are white than when victims are African American. And if it's an African American who's charged with a crime against a white person, forget about it. I mean, every prosecutor I know has stories about how differently those cases are treated. And so this case, with these kind of historical Jim Crow vestiges of, a tree that only white students are allowed to, or by practice, sit under, and a noose hanging under the tree. And when African Americans complain about that, then all of this kind of racial animus comes to the forefront. So I think, again, it just had a lot of historical resonance for a lot of African Americans for whom lynching is a very real memory it controls, even now, where we feel comfortable. So I think people had a lot of concerns about that, number one, that history. And number two, about the present racism and discrimination that a lot of people see in the criminal justice system. So, again, the racial disparities are extremely well known. More young black men in prison than in college, 1 out of 3 with a criminal case. Just so many very depressing statistics. There was we're going to talk about marches. On the day of the Million Man March, President Clinton made a speech where he said white people should think about how they would feel if 1 out of 3 young white men was under criminal justice system. He suggested that it would be a national outrage, but when it's only African Americans, again, it doesn't seem like such a big deal. It almost seems like they're in prison because they're supposed to be in prison. And I think a lot of people, African Americans, Latinos, and a bunch of white people just think that it's wrong. And it is just another vestige of white supremacy and the kind of discrimination that African Americans have encountered in the legal arena, in the social arena. Again, no equal justice. So this is just another iteration of that. And people said enough is enough. Again, there's lots of battles lots of battlefronts we could choose, but if not this one, then when?
Yeah, so that's the question, I guess. I agree with a lot of what you said, particularly the problems with the criminal justice system and the way in which the incidents at Jena had really disturbing resonance with some of the worst of Jim Crow segregation. I guess the place where we might disagree is whether or not Free the Jena 6 is the right motto for the civil rights movement as we move forward. And just a few things about that. One thing that struck me about the Jena 6 controversy is the way that you had a lot of different incidents that have to be taken as a whole, I think, in order to really understand what people were upset about. But the difficulty is that each one of those incidents was, there was a different decision maker at fault, and I think, you could make the case that at least the current charges, not attempted murder, but the current aggravated battery charges against the Jena 6 is appropriate and isn't the real problem, that the real problem started when there was a white tree and nobody in the school did anything about that. And they continued when the students were given a slap on the wrist rather than a more appropriate punishment for hanging nooses on that tree, demonstrating insensitivity or ignorance about race relations. But
is
segregation in the schools.
Richard, do you think it's appropriate when the white students who've been involved in violence and inciting racial hatred against African Americans, when they aren't charged? Again, maybe no one would be complaining if the white students who were guilty have been charged at the same level. But again, when it's only the African Americans who are charged, then you do have to wonder whether it's appropriate.
Right. Well, see, but that brings me back to the problem that the different incidents had different decision makers in some cases, and that it's pretty tough to make these incidents commensurable. So I think it's the school board that's responsible for charging the white students who hung the nooses on the tree. I mean, apparently there was no crime under Louisiana law. I mean, I guess I take the prosecutor's word for that. That he didn't. So he wasn't. He didn't have the capacity to do anything about that incident.
And but then it was the DA who made the rest of the decision. So we had the white boy who points a gun at 3 African Americans and isn't charged with a darn thing. So come on.
Right. No, that's true. And I have to say I do have some doubts about this prosecutor. But I'm not sure when you focus on the specific incident whether. I guess I have trouble with the idea that we, that we have an approach to the criminal justice system in which, 6 kids who kick a guy when he's on the ground unconscious, that's justifiable because of what some other white people did to some other black.
No one's saying it's justifiable.
That worries me.
Yeah, no one's saying it's justifiable. It's just that when it comes to law enforcement, what's good enough for African Americans is good enough for white people. So again, if you're going to treat the African American defendants with the full force of the law, none of its mercy, none of its leniency, just its punishment, then it does seem unfair to not treat the white people the same way. And again, when you say, well, there's a lot of different decision makers. Again, Richard, you wrote one of the books on anti-discrimination law, so and some of this, you've done some of the seminal work, which I have so much respect for. But you know how hard it is in the law, especially for discrimination, if we're just looking for one bad guy, one bad actor, when lots of times discrimination is the result of a bunch of forces, some of which you can point to a single bad actor, but some of it is a bunch of apparently race-neutral actions that turn out to have this horrible racial effect, and we see that so often in the criminal justice laws. In the McCluskey case, that's the case when the Supreme Court looked at the reality in Georgia death penalty, where you were much more likely to get the death penalty if you were a white if you were an African American who killed a white person than any other variation of race, defendant, and victim. And the court said something kind of like what you're saying now, Richard. Well, there's so many variables, every case is different. Even though in the McCluskey case they controlled for like 200 or something variables, the court said we still can't say that, we still can't know for sure. So if you're always looking for some kind of proof of discrimination to a scientific certainty, you're not going to get it.
Right. No. I mean that's not my point. I guess the point I am trying to make is that if the way the protest has unfolded, the theme has been "Free the Jena 6," and it strikes me that distracts attention from many of the other more severe underlying problems. So now we're having a discussion about whether these, whether a charge of, I guess at this point it's aggravated battery is appropriate in this specific case, in a context in which, what these 6 kids did was pretty bad, as opposed to a discussion about why the school is segregated, de facto segregated in the first place. That seems to be where this really began. And I'd love to see a rally in favor of those 3 kids who sat under the white tree and showed some real guts, rather than in favor of kids who kicked somebody when he was unconscious. Just as a symbolic matter, they're not the best symbols of a new civil rights movement.
And of course, that's
another.
Let me just jump in there, because that's a kind of old, and I might say old-fashioned concern in terms of how we fight civil rights battles. So
right.
I think Richard is.
I may be old-fashioned in this respect.
And again, some of my heroes in the movement are old-fashioned, so nothing wrong with that per se. But I'm thinking, Richard, about Thurgood Marshall and the politics of respectability. So then lawyer Marshall was running probably the best public interest law firm of all time, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And when he started out, he had a rule that they wouldn't represent people who were accused of rape of white women. Now, historically, that was certainly one of the crimes for which there was the most evidence of race bias, lots of trumped-up charges, lots of just punishment that didn't seem deserved, in part because guilt was never proven conclusively to people who were looking from the outside. For example, the only people who got the death penalty for that crime were, again, black men accused of raping white women. So lots and lots of evidence of discrimination. Justice Marshall, again, then lawyer Marshall, conceded that discrimination, but said it didn't look right for his organization to be representing those people. Now, later, he had a change of heart about that. But again, when I hear you, Richard, say, well, again, I'm not sure these are the best poster kids for a civil rights movement. Again, maybe they're not the best, but again, we're fighting this on a bunch of levels. We're certainly thinking about affirmative action and how kids like you and me, who maybe did a little bit better in school or a lot better in school, and probably worked harder than some people who wind up in the criminal justice system. But I think, Richard, you and I would also agree that we had a bunch of breaks. So again, part of the people who are discriminated against are people like you and I, who are maybe more deserving. But people who make mistakes, again, that doesn't mean that they're also not the victims of discrimination. And when they are, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned.
I agree with that. But what I see here, are a couple of things. It does worry me that the ethos seems to be, if we see an instance where these white kids were potentially undercharged for some thing that they did, and I suppose that it does have to be added that none of those incidents were as severe as the ones that the Jena 6 were charged with. We seem to have an escalating pattern of violence.
Well, I don't know. Well, who knows what would have happened if those young black men hadn't grabbed the gun from the white boy? We might be looking at a murder case. And again, attempted murder.
But it didn't happen, and so, that means that we shouldn't have any prosecution, for this incident, and I don't think I agree with that as a matter of policy, but more importantly, that doesn't get a focus on some of the issues that you were talking about earlier, that when I think it's true that part of the reason this case has created so much attention and anxiety in the black community is because of much broader issues that have to do with the vastly disparate incarceration rates of black men, much of which has to do with mandatory federal sentencing guidelines, things like 3 strikes and you're out in California, structural issues in the criminal justice system, and those aren't just cases, and in fact aren't even primarily cases of prosecutorial bias, and I don't deny that that plays a role, but those are larger problems of kind of a get tough on crime attitude that falls with disproportionate severity on black communities, and I guess it strikes me that those are the larger issues.
Let me say why I think that those cases do a lot of times involve police bias and prosecutorial bias. The interesting thing about the statistics is if you look at these racial disparities in criminal justice, they've gone way up since the 1970s. And you got to ask, well, what's happened since then? Normally we think of the difference between, let's say, 1975 and 2007 as one where blacks have a lot more opportunities now than we did back then. But a much higher percentage of us are locked up now. So did we suddenly become so much more dangerous or immoral that, now we got to be locked up at a rate we didn't have to be locked up in the 1970s? The answer is no. What happened basically was the war on drugs. So there was this policy that we're going to get tough on that crime. That resulted in this dramatic expansion in the number of African Americans in prison. The really interesting thing about that is, again, we might find some crimes, and violent crime, unfortunately, is one of those that black people disproportionately commit. Drugs, we actually don't. Richard, you and I both work on college campuses, so we know that there are a whole bunch of white people who use drugs. Latinos, Asians, African Americans, it's probably one of the few crimes that people actually commit, according to the National Institute of Health, pretty much in proportion to their percentage of the population. So NIH says African Americans are about 12% of people who commit drug crimes on a monthly basis. If you go to the Department of Justice, look at their statistics, we're 75% of the people in prison for that crime. 12% of people who do the crime, 75% of people who do the time. So that's just straight out selective law enforcement, discriminatory prosecutions against African Americans.
Okay, well, it's an interesting set of statistics. I do wonder, I would have one question about them, though, which is, to what extent do those statistics disaggregate for the severity of the drug crime? In other words, things like how much of the drug is being is found on the person. Are they a dealer as opposed to a user? Because I imagine that would make some difference in the statistics. And again, I'm not denying the problem of prosecutorial bias, but I do wonder whether whether a broader problem has to do with the fact that certainly during the 80s, in some minority communities, the problem of drug dealing, drug-related crimes that in many cases involved violence and were quite severe was a real problem. And one of the things, just to go back to McCleskey for a second, one of the things that the statistics there demonstrated, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, was that the main variable was not, in terms of whether a defendant got the death penalty, was not the race of the perpetrator, but the race of the victim.
Yeah, that's right.
So there's a question there about whether. I have a lot of problems with the war on drugs, by the way. I'm not going to defend the war on drugs, but
it does seem to me.
No, not at all. And my own view is that a lot of these things could be dealt with better through decriminalization and treating it as a public health problem. Not all, but a lot. But I would say that in the context in the 80s, and especially late 80s and early 90s, when the drug epidemic and the criminal violence around that, gang warfare and the like, was at its peak, a real problem was whether there was enough law enforcement to protect black communities, and most of the crime involved blacks committing crimes against other blacks. So that story is a little more complicated.
But in those cases, you wouldn't be arresting people for drug offenses. You'd be arresting people for violent crimes or robbery, stuff like that. So when we look at the actual drug statistics, again, I don't think there's any way to explain it other than just discrimination. Now, it's a discrimination. Some of my police officer friends, prosecutor friends, African American, Latino, and white, they say, yeah, you know what, Paul? We do selectively enforce the drug laws in the African American community, but we do it because we think it's in the best interest of that community. So the argument there is that law enforcement is a public good. It's kind of like a park or a school. The more any group has of it, the better.
Right.
So again, there might be some arguments in favor of selective prosecution, selective arrest. I wouldn't agree with those arguments, but I understand the people who make those arguments sometimes think it really is in the best interest of the community. Bottom line, though, is I don't think there's any way to deny that African Americans face a rather extraordinary amount of discrimination in criminal justice. You say, just real quickly, you say, well, why criminal justice as opposed to some of the other kinds of discrimination that perhaps more, quote-unquote, deserving black people face? If we look at the disparities...
No, I didn't say that.
If we look at the disparities, again, unemployment, 2-to-1 disparity. Unwed births, 3-to-1 disparity. Rate of incarceration, 8-to-1. 8-to-1 disparity. So again, if we're going to focus on discrimination, we almost have to start with criminal justice because that's where it's most extreme.
Okay, but let me just correct a couple of things. I didn't say, first of all, I didn't say focus on other things to the exclusion of criminal justice. I do think we need to focus on the criminal justice system. I don't disagree with that. But the question is where and in what context. It's interesting, Paul, because you started off saying something which I think is at the root of the problem. And it's a broader problem than is revealed by something like the Jena 6. Prosecutors have almost untrammeled discretion. And they, not only that, but they also, to the extent that the DA is elected, they have an incentive to, in some cases, I would say, abuse that discretion in going after, high-profile criminal cases. And I expect this was high-profile in Jena. And, it became high-profile nationwide after the protest. But before that, it was probably high-profile in the town. So, there's a problem with the criminal justice system generally, and that problem of prosecutorial overzealousness, no doubt falls with disproportionate force on black communities. But it's not limited to them. Ask the Duke lacrosse team. That's a bigger problem that needs to be addressed too. But you don't see that. And then again,
and
things
you
like
also don't see the outrage
sentencing
against the Jena prosecutor that we see against the Duke prosecutor. Mr. Nifong has been disbarred, tarred, and feathered. Again, the Jena 6 prosecutor is still putting black people in prison.
True. Okay, but there is a difference. In this case, in the Duke case, it looks like the people didn't, were innocent entirely, and the evidence showed that fairly early on, and the prosecutor pushed ahead. No one's arguing that the Jena 6 didn't actually do what they're accused of doing. The question is, what's the appropriate punishment? So that's a little different. But I do want to go back to the question of mandatory minimum sentencing, 3 strikes, these types of things, which strike me as a larger problem, and a problem that, at least on the surface, isn't a problem of discriminatory prosecution. It's a problem of overzealousness about crime. It's a problem of the wrong approach to crime prevention. Now, you might argue that the reason people voted for this was because it reflects some sort of underlying bias, and I'd be inclined to agree with that to some extent. But it is a different problem, and at least the way this has been taken up in the protest and in the media doesn't really help us to get it that.
Well, I think the reason that you and I are now talking about, again, what's evolving into a discussion of larger issues about racial disparities is because of the Jena 6 protests. So again, maybe they're not the perfect poster children, but this was an opportunity that civil rights activists seized on. And so we're having this discussion about racism and criminal justice because of that moment, because of the exploitation of that opportunity. Because of that rally, Richard, I don't know if you saw the evening news that day, but it was the lead story on ABC, CBS, and NBC. CNN continuing coverage of the rally the whole day. Stories in the New York Times, Washington Post, and all of the news weeklies. And again, none of them focus exclusively on what happened at Jena 6. They understood that this was supposed to be a story that had much larger consequences. And those consequences got discussed, just as we're discussing them now. So again, I think it was a real remarkable achievement, a way of starting this national conversation about racism in criminal justice, and even more broadly about how racism is still around in 2007?
Well, I guess you're more optimistic than I am about the long-term effect. Certainly, anytime these issues can be discussed, that in and of itself is a good thing. But I do worry that the way they're discussed and the context in which they're discussed might distort the conversation. And I suppose along those lines, a lot of what the civil rights movement achieved, it seems to be, had to do with changing people's hearts and minds, and that still has to be a big part of the goal. That and that involves bringing along people who aren't yet convinced that there's a problem in some particular context. And what worries me there is that if you focusing on something like this case, and particularly Free the Jena 6, which became the rallying cry, may well repel some people who are on the fence, or could be convinced by a more sympathetic case. So without saying something like we should reserve our outrage for more deserving blacks, I don't say something like that. But I would say that there's a limit to the number of rallies you can have. There's a limit to the amount of attention that you can get for these types of issues, and there's a limit to the moral capital that civil rights organizations have.
But Richard, exactly.
And there are important questions about whether where to focus, where to spend, I suppose.
Okay, so all these white folks who are waiting for just the right moment to jump into advocacy about civil rights and the end of discrimination. Where are they? What are they waiting for to happen? If not the Jena 6, then what?
Wait, I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the question. All these white folks are waiting to jump in.
I thought you said that the way that the civil rights movement has been waged is to win hearts and minds. And the Jena 6 isn't going to do that. So I'm asking, well, what is and when?
Well, I don't have a specific example right now, except, actually I gave one. What about segregation de facto segregation in high school campuses? It strikes me that this is where this Jena 6 problem began, and I would hope that there might be an opportunity to address that in a comprehensive way, so that you don't wind up in the end of the day with the Jena 6 after you've had a whole series of racial tensions and conflicts that have gone unresolved and unaddressed. That's one example, and that strikes me as a quite severe and very pervasive problem, not just in the South, but in the North and the West and everywhere. That school administrators and students alike are responsible for, and that we haven't done enough to try to address. So there's one example.
But again, first of all, I guess I don't see that as having the same consequences as again a bunch of white students hanging a noose on a tree. Again, if African American students and Asian students want to sit at a table and white students want to sit at another table, that's one thing. Again, is that in the best interest of their education and socialization? No, I don't think so. But again, I don't think it has the same kinds of consequences. But the nuisance incident started as a result of crossing these racial lines. If the concern is how can people who are concerned about racism and discrimination and white supremacy in 2007, how can we launch a movement, and especially how can we attack the most damaging aspects of that white supremacy? Again, I don't see how focusing on people sitting where they sit at lunchtime is the best route.
So you didn't have a problem with the idea that there was a white tree in this school that everyone understood was off limits to black students?
I don't think, again, that that's in the best interest of those students' education, because they have to grow up and live in the real world. But to the extent that you walk into George Washington or Stanford and see people hanging around sometimes with people who look like them, again, in terms of the list of things that I'm concerned about, that's not real high on the list.
Well, but it didn't look like this was a case of just people hanging around with students that looked like them, unless this looked like a pretty rigidly enforced de facto racial line that, when it was transgressed, led to your noose incident. I mean, you can't separate the nooses from the existence of the white tree.
So that's why, when you talk about the issue of people socializing with people of their own race in the North and the South, as you mentioned, I agree that that's an issue, but it's not the same thing. When it's enforced by nooses, then it takes on a whole different character. But it's two different problems.
Right, but I don't think it's not different in kind. I mean, it's certainly different in degree, but the problem began with the existence of this white tree that everyone agreed was off limits to black students, and when some black students sat under it, then you wound up with the noose incident. So they're connected. And that's the reason that you had a whole series of racial tensions in this town, is because people thought, they're the white students over here and the black students over here, and they're two tribes that are opposed to each other. And, that attitude led right up to the idea that, right up to the end.
Well, Richard, you and I both went to Harvard Law School, so there was a black table there sometimes, Asian table, Latino table. But I think that there was also a lot of interracial socializing. Some of my best friends from law school are white and Asian and Latino, as well as African American. So again, it's a separate phenomenon. But we're getting late in the hour. One of the most provocative things I thought from your article on Slate was imagining kind of a new civil rights movement. It's a new century. So clearly some of the issues and some of the techniques are going to be different. So what's that mean? So what, I have so much respect for the work that you've done in this area, Richard. What civil rights in 2007 mean to you?
That's a great question and a big question. I think that, I agree with a lot of what you're saying about the criminal justice system, that one of the biggest places where we see severe racial disparities is in the criminal justice system. And I suppose, I'd begin by, one, asking questions about the extent of prosecutorial discretion generally, which is a problem for criminal defendants generally, and ask whether or not there are ways that we could keep a little tighter rein on what prosecutors do, especially in the highly politicized context that comes with crime. I'd go back to the war on drugs and the problems that have resulted from that, and ask whether there are better ways for us to deal with the problems of drug use and violent crime in inner cities than the current quite punitive law enforcement approach. I'd also talk about neighborhood segregation, because in the end, a lot of these problems boil down to that. Even what you mentioned about selective enforcement of criminal laws in minority communities on the part of what you described as decent, fair-minded people who thought they were doing what was best for the community by, giving them more law enforcement. Part of the reason that falls with such severity on African Americans is because of neighborhood segregation, which continues to be a problem that's almost as severe as it was in the Jim Crow era. And in some cities, it's arguably gotten worse. And the isolation of the black and minority underclass, their isolation from jobs and job opportunities, that strikes me as the civil rights issue of the 21st century. And I think really the crux is neighborhood segregation, and if you could deal with that comprehensively, if we could have a war on segregation, then a lot of these other problems would begin to unravel. Now, that's not to say that there's no bias in any instance. I don't think that. But I do think that there's a lot less bias today than there was in the 1960s and 70s, and that would include prosecutors. And so the disparities that we're seeing are, by and large, a result of other forces. And I think neighborhood segregation is a big one. And that's more severe than segregation within schools, to be sure. So that's where I'd start. Any thoughts yourself?
Well, I agree that residential segregation remains a huge problem, but again, I just don't want to underplay or devalue the extraordinary significance that race by itself, apart from class and apart from neighborhood segregation, still continues to play, not just in criminal justice, but in lots of other areas of American life. But in terms of the tactic, too, Richard, one of the things that was so exciting to me about the Jena 6 protests is how they got started. And they got started on the Internet. They didn't come from the Legal Defense Fund. You know, Thurgood Marshall, bless his heart, was famous for identifying the problem and then going around and finding clients to make his case. And that's probably not the best way to actually represent what the people want, especially the people who are suffering the ills. And what happened with Jena 6 was people in the community started buzzing about it on the Internet. They started sending emails and talking to people on blogs about it. Very, very 21st century. And from that, the word got out to some radio hosts, most famously Michael Baisden. And the radio hosts started buzzing about it. And it wasn't until way down the line, much further in the process, that the traditional civil rights organizations, the NAACP, the Urban League, and people like Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson got involved. So this is something that's more grassroots generated. And I'm so happy to see progressive people, African Americans and Latinos, taking advantage of this modern technology, these new ways of thinking about problems and especially of getting the word out.
Well, that's a really appropriate thing to say given our forum, and that's very interesting. So I guess, one thing I would like to say, I agree with you about the fact that race and racial bias is still a problem. I don't want to suggest that I think that's a thing of the past. I'm only suggesting that I think there are lots of other forces that are playing a significant role as well, and that one difficulty with is that although we may know that there's racial bias prevalent due to things like statistics, it can often be very hard to identify it in a particular instance. But one thing that we can identify are some of these larger structural forces that are leading to the statistical disparities, and we can attack those. But yeah, I love the stuff about the internet, and obviously it's a medium that's got a lot of potential and a lot of context. It's great that it's reaching some of that potential in the civil rights struggle too.
Yeah, and that sounds like a good place, since we're talking about the internet and potential, to thank Blinding Heads for letting us have this conversation.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you. Okay, take care, Paul.
Yeah, Richard, really good talking to you. Let's next time we're in the same place, let's try to get together.
All right, I like that.
Cool.
Okay, take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.